So the minister was relatively annoyed. Every week during worship, there'd be an elderly gentleman who would sit in the pew and sleep during the sermon. Every week that would happen. And the minister noticed that there was a small boy who sat with the elderly gentleman. And so finally, after a few days of this, he pulled the boy aside and he said, "Who is the older man that you sit with?" And the boy said, "That's my grandpa." And the minister said, "I tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. If you can keep him awake during the sermon, I'll give you a dime every week." Kid thought that sounded like a pretty good idea, so he agreed to that. And for 2 weeks, everything went great. And the elderly gentleman stayed very attentive during the sermon. Third week, right back to sleep. Slept through the entire sermon. And after church, the minister pulled the little boy aside and he said, "I thought we agreed. You were going to keep him awake. I was going to give you a dime." The little boy said, "Yeah, but Grandpa said he'd give me a quarter to leave him alone." So today we continue our current series, A Journey of Hope. It's going to take us all the way to Easter Sunday, and frankly, that's not very long right now. We're getting closer and closer and closer to Easter Sunday. And then we're going to walk through a lot of the highlights of the Easter story along the way, and we're going to stop every now and then to meet an unlikely character or experience an unexpected event. Today we're going to detour a fair amount off the beaten path, and we're going to journey into the garden. And we're going to see what we can learn about what Jesus has to teach us about prayer. And I want to start by sharing a piece from Psalm 66 that talks very much about prayer. Hear these words. "All of you who fear God, come and listen, and I will tell you what he's done for me. I cried out to him with my mouth, and I praised him with my tongue. If I'd known of any sin in my heart, the Lord wouldn't have listened to me, but God has listened. He's heard my prayer. So praise God who didn't ignore my prayer or hold back his love for me." That's pretty much exactly the kind of thing we're going to look at today. But I want to start out by saying prayer is not asking God for stuff. Prayer is not like your Christmas wish list and Jesus is not like Santa. Prayer is a different thing altogether. Prayer is a longing of the soul. It's a daily admission of our human weakness. It's a means of refueling our souls. It's a way to connect us with the true source of our life, the one who knows us from the inside out, the one who helps us in a way that no one else could ever imagine to do. And prayer is absolutely essential for this journey of hope. Because prayer forms a deeper bond with God. Prayer helps us form that deeper bond. Prayer builds spiritual strength. It's kind of like spiritual exercise for your spiritual muscles. And Jesus shows us that even in the worst of times. And I want to share that with you now. Fairly familiar story. I chose the version from the Gospel of Mark. 14th chapter. Hear these words. Jesus and his followers went to the place called Gethsemane. Jesus said to them, "Sit here while I pray." And Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be very sad and troubled. "My heart is full of sorrow to the point of death," he said. "Stay here and watch." And after walking a little further away from them, Jesus fell to the ground, and he prayed that if possible, he wouldn't have this time of suffering. He said, "Abba, Father, you can do all things. Take away this cup of suffering, but do what you want and not what I want." So to go the distance in this journey, we have to learn how and when and where to refuel spiritually. Because when we're depleted, spiritually, emotionally, physically, we have nowhere to go. So where do we turn to refuel when we feel that way? Do we turn to one of our typical quick fix, stopgap remedies that really do nothing more than numb the pain? Or do we instead reach for life-giving resources that can actually make a real and lasting difference in our lives? See, I think for many people, sadly, God is a last resort. Something they only turn to when they have exhausted all other possible painkillers in their lives. And that's where we're at as we turn to Jesus here. So he shared the Last Supper with his disciples. That's what's happened immediately before this scene. Now think about that. The Last Supper. Jesus is like a death row prisoner in that story. He's having his last meal before his ultimate date with the executioner. He knows that. I don't think the disciples believe that, but he knows that this is his last supper. And so when the meal is over, he and the disciples leave the friendly confines of the upper room, and they go out into the dark, deserted streets. Jesus seems to clearly know where he's going. The disciples have no clue, and so they just kind of obediently follow along, keeping silent. They leave the city through what's known as the Fountain Gate, and they start heading up the hill. And suddenly the disciples know where he's headed. He's headed to the garden that's called Gethsemane. They know that Jesus' life is in danger. And they know that it would be so easy, now that he's snuck out of the city, it'd be so easy to just keep right on going. Don't look back, don't stop, don't pass go, don't collect $200, just go and escape all of this. But they also know that Jesus is never going to do that. He's never going to agree to that. He has a date with destiny, and he isn't going to stop just because they wanted to. And so they walk up the hill and they arrive in the garden, and these bone-tired, worn-out disciples immediately do what any good and well-intended person would do in that circumstance. They prop themselves up against trees and they fall asleep. Immediately. Meanwhile, Jesus wanders off away from them deeper into the garden. He knows that there's a confrontation with the religious authorities that's coming. And it's going to set his death in motion. And it's going to happen sooner as opposed to later. He knows that a Roman cross is in his immediate future. And he's afraid. He's afraid. Think about that. The creator of the universe is scared. And you say, well, how can that be? I don't get that. Well, to understand that, you have to understand the dual nature of Jesus. He is both fully God and fully man. Now, let that sink in and wrap your head around that for a minute. He is fully God and he is fully man. And you say, can't be both. Not possible. You can't be 100% one thing and 100% another thing. Understand that on the surface, but think through that a little bit more. I'm many more than two things. I am fully husband. I am fully dad. I am fully son. And all sorts of other things that you could put in that list. We are many things at one time. So Jesus is fully God, and yet he is fully man. And the man in him is afraid. He's scared about what's coming. And there in the stillness of the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus, the man, prays for divine intervention. And did you notice what he said? He said, Abba, Father, you can do all things. Take away this cup of suffering. And I wonder when I think about this story, would the cross on Friday have made any real impact? Would it have had any real meaning at all without this prelude in the garden? Without this story, would the cross really have mattered? Because it would have been easy for Jesus to go straight from the upper room to the cross. But if he did that, wouldn't we question the value of it? It's just another thing to do to finish the story. I think Jesus had to wrestle with what was ahead of him. And this is where he does it, is in the garden. So fear and doubt had worked their way into Jesus, the man. Worked his way into his heart and his mind. He didn't want to die. Think about this. He's only 33 years old. And the fear of the Roman cross is very real. He had seen the agony of the condemned who had hung on the cross before him. And every bit of his humanness, his humanity, shuddered at the thought of having to die that way. If you read the Gospel of Luke account, that fear and that doubt actually glistened in the sweating of blood that was on his brow as he faced this central test of his relatively young earthly life. Now this piece is really important because nowhere else in the Gospels do you get to see this kind of emotion from Jesus. Nowhere else is he this human. Because did you notice how Mark described him? He was full of sorrow to the point of death. Full of sorrow to the point of death. The fully human Jesus wanted to be spared the ordeal that he knew lay ahead of him. He didn't want to die, and frankly, who can blame him? Who would want to suffer like he knew he was going to? But the key isn't that he didn't want to do it or that he was afraid. The key is he did it anyway. He rose above it. He overcame the doubt. He overcame the fear. He pulled himself up, and he pulled himself together physically and spiritually. And ultimately, Jesus responded with complete submission to what God was calling him to do. Did you hear what he says to God at the end of his prayer? Do what you want, not what I want. That's a hard thing to pray under any circumstance. But that attitude is only possible if we settle the underlying theological question in this story. And that question is, who is God? You've got to settle that question before you can decide whether the rest of it makes any sense or not. Well, to answer that question, I want you to think for a minute about what Jesus calls God in this story. He calls him Abba, Father. And Abba here is not a Swedish rock group. I want to tell you that up front. But do you know what Abba means in this setting? Abba means daddy. Abba means daddy. Jesus knew he could wrestle with God because he saw God as Abba, Father, Daddy. And you can say anything to your dad and he will still love you. And this struck me because I was thinking about a book. There was a book called A Day That No Pigs Would Die. Strange title for a book, I'll give you that. But the book chronicles the life of a boy growing up in Vermont. And the boy's family ekes out a meager existence. They barely get by. And one particularly hard winter, things are so bad that his dad decides that the only way they're going to survive the winter is if he butchers the boy's pet pig. It's the only way they're going to survive. They simply don't have enough food to make it through the winter. And I want to read you a passage from the book that occurs after the pig is butchered. The boy says, "Oh, Papa, my heart is broke." And the dad says, "So's mine. I just broke down and Papa let me cry. And I sobbed with my head up toward the sky and my eyes closed, hoping that God would hear me. And then I felt his big hand touch my face. It wasn't the hand that killed hogs. It was a hand almost as sweet as Mama's. His hand was rough and it was cold. And as I opened my eyes to look at it, I could see his knuckles dripping with pig's blood. This was the hand that had butchered my pig. But he did it because he had to. He hated to, but he had to. And he knew he was never going to have to say to me, sorry. Because his hand against my face, trying to wipe away my tears, said it all. His cruel, pig-sticking fist with its thick fingers so lightly against my cheek. And I kissed his hand again and again with all its stink, so that he'd understand that I'd trust and forgive him, even if he killed me. And I was still holding his hand as he straightened up, tall against the gray winter sky. And he looked down at me, and then he looked away. And with his free arm, he raked his sleeve of his work shirt across his eyes. It was the first time I ever had seen him cry. It was the only time. That's Abba. That's Abba. That's the daddy, the pig-sticking daddy who loves his son. And when that which has to be done is so devastating to both of them, it's the one who feels his son's pain right along with his own. The big lesson to be learned in the Garden of Gethsemane is that if you can call God Abba, Father, Daddy, everything else becomes bearable. We won't always understand it, but we will always know that the Father's hand will never cause us needless tears. And that's exactly what Jesus knew that night on his knees deep in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's why he was able to go on. And that can be true for us as well if we want it to be. It was in the garden, in Gethsemane, that Jesus allowed his soul to be crucified. Think about that. His soul was crucified in Gethsemane. It was on Golgotha that he simply relinquished his body. The truth is that we can face the central test of our lives a whole lot better when we're willing to seek God's fellowship and God's love. Because once Jesus was in the garden, he had left the disciples behind and he went to be alone with God, and he falls on his knees. But why? Because he wants to be in conversation with his daddy. See, I think we often pray when we're scared, when we feel life is closing in around us, when we think we're being tested. That's what Jesus did. That's exactly what he did. He prayed. And he wasn't merely telling God what he wanted, but he was instead trying to align himself with God. He was trying to seek God's presence, seek God's will for his life. We all have times when we feel like we're being hemmed in by our problems. We don't know where else to turn. Even Jesus felt that way. But notice he didn't respond by lashing out. He didn't respond by giving up. He didn't simply try to laugh off the pain. Instead, he responded by sincerely seeking God in prayer. And it seems to me if Jesus followed that path when he faced the central test of his life, shouldn't we do the same? Are you willing to sacrifice what you are for what you could become through God? In the New Testament book of James, it says this in the very first chapter. But if any of you needs wisdom, you should ask God for it. He is generous to everyone, and he will give you wisdom without criticizing you. But when you ask God, you must believe and not doubt. Anyone who doubts is like a wave in the sea blown up and down by the wind. Such doubters are thinking two different things at the same time. They can't decide anything that they do. They shouldn't think that they will receive anything from the Lord. Here, just a few weeks before Easter, do you feel like life is closing in on you? Do you feel like you're knee-deep or some days neck-deep in crisis? Maybe you feel like you're stuck in the middle of a dark period in your life, surrounded by turmoil constantly. Follow Jesus' lead here. Follow his example. Turn to Abba, Father, Daddy. When you are facing the tests of your life, look at what Jesus did in the garden. He sought God's fellowship and prayer and sought God's will for his life. As the musicians come forward, would you pray with me?